She had lived 26 years, and her own father had never once called her by her name. Not once. She was the girl. She was her. She was something he needed to get rid of. Then a quiet man on a mountain said 2 words, just her name, Mary, and something inside her that had been dying for years began to breathe again. Stay with me. This one will change how you see people. Here we tell the stories the West was really made of. Not just gunfighters and gold, but the quiet courage of women who were thrown away and refused to stay broken. The lesson? Sometimes the most powerful thing you can give another person isn't money or rescue. It's simply saying their name like it matters. Subscribe and ride with us. Like this if it moved you. Share it. Someone in your life needs this story today. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.
Her father, Hank, slammed his hand on the table. Done. He was already pouring whiskey for the broad-shouldered stranger, never once looking at his daughter. She's a strong one, Hank said, just like he was talking about a new mule. Hardly speaks, won't cause you a bit of trouble. But the stranger, Elias Boone, didn't touch his glass. He just watched Hank, his hat pulled low. Does she know about this arrangement? He asked, his voice quiet. Hank just laughed it off. She don't need to know. She just needs to do as she's told. Elias didn't back down. I'm asking if she agreed to it. That's when Hank's jaw went tight. Mister, I'm offering you a good deal. 3 horses, all the supplies you need, and a woman who'll work hard. You want it or not? Elias was silent for a long moment. Then, real slow, he turned his head and looked straight at Mary. She felt a jolt, not of fear, but of pure shock. Nobody had looked at her like that, like he could see the whole world she kept hidden inside. Ma'am, he said, his voice calm and respectful. Her own father cut in. She's just shy is all. Elias kept his eyes on Mary. I wasn't asking you. That silence hit the porch like a crack of lightning. Hank Whitaker's face turned beet red, not used to being challenged on his own land. Ma'am, Elias said again to Mary, do you want to come with me? Mary looked from her father to the empty house where her mother died, then back to this man asking her a question nobody ever had. Does it matter what I want? She whispered. Elias tilted his head. It matters to me. Hank slammed his glass on the table. The deal is done, Boone. Elias stood up slow, towering over her father. I'll take the deal, he said, his voice steady. But I am not buying a person. I am offering one a choice. They rode out at first light. Mary's entire life, 26 years of it, fit into one small canvas bag, a dress, a comb, and her mother's old Bible. Elias moved with a quiet purpose, loading the pack horses without a single wasted motion. He was a man who understood that the mountains didn't pay any mind to idle talk. She climbed onto the mare he'd brought for her, not asking a single question. Asking questions just got you noticed, and she'd learned long ago that was a bad thing. They rode away from the ranch, away from the church where the preacher once said she'd find her purpose in serving others, a polite way of saying no man would ever marry her. She was leaving it all behind and felt nothing but a hollow emptiness. A few hours later, Elias stopped by a creek. Let's water the horses, he said, then added, Are you hungry? Mary just shook her head. He studied her for a second before pulling some jerky from his saddlebag. He tore off a piece for himself and set the rest on a rock near her without another word. She stared at it. At the ranch, she always ate last, if there was anything left at all. She picked up the jerky and chewed, watching him. How far is your place? She finally asked. About 2 days' ride, up in the timberline, he answered. It gets cold. I don't mind the cold. He gave her a look, not of pity, but of understanding. Like he knew exactly what a person meant when they said they were used to being uncomfortable. It is a small cabin, he went on. Solid walls and a stone fireplace. I built most of it myself. He paused. I have been alone for a long time, ma'am. Mary knew what he meant. You could be lonely in a house full of people. She had been proving that her whole life. That evening, he made camp and laid out 2 bedrolls, one for him and one for her, a good distance apart. She watched his large, scarred hands as he worked. They looked like they could be gentle or strong, whatever was needed. You can take that one, he said, nodding to her bedroll. I will keep the first watch. Lying there under the stars, she found her voice. Elias, why did you take me? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. I do need help on my homestead, he started, poking the fire with a stick. But when I saw you standing by that fence, I have seen horses that were broken the wrong way. I know what it looks like when a living thing has been taught it is worthless. Mary's chest felt tight. You are not worthless, ma'am, he said, his voice soft but sure. Whatever he told you, it is not the truth. Ooh. She rolled over, her back to the fire so he could not see her face. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt safe. They arrived at his homestead the next afternoon. It was a simple log cabin tucked against a ridge with a creek nearby and a small corral. It is not much, Elias said from behind her. It is yours, she replied. It is ours, he corrected her, if you choose to stay. He pulled the saddle from his horse. Like I told your father, I am not buying a person. You are free to leave any time you want. I will give you a horse and supplies, and point you toward any town you name. Mary just stared at him, confused. Why would you do that? Because that is how things ought to work. That is not how anything works, she said. He looked at her, a small smile on his face. Then maybe it is time it did. Nobody had ever told Mary she could leave. For years, she was a piece of property, nothing more. So when Elias told her she was free to go, she just stood there, stunned. Instead, she picked up her bag and walked toward his cabin. That first week was quiet, filled with the kind of hard work she understood. Elias gave her the bedroom and slept by the fireplace. He never asked her to cook or clean, just showed her the chores that needed doing. Fences, traps, the garden. Work was the only language her hands knew, even when her heart was silent. One morning, she found him fixing a corral fence. A post had rotted clean through. She walked up and said, I can hold that for you. He just nodded and handed her the new post. They worked side by side for a solid hour without a single word. When they finished, he stepped back, looked it over, and said, That will hold. I can tell you have done fence work before. It was not a compliment, just a fact, and it made her stand a little bit taller. On the 6th day, she was checking the trap line down by the creek when she heard it. Hoofbeats coming up fast from the south. She grabbed the rifle Elias had told her to carry and hid behind a big rock. 2 rough-looking men on horseback appeared, one with a rope on his saddle, the other with a shotgun resting on his lap. They stopped and pointed toward the meadow where Elias kept his cattle. Mary's heart was pounding in her chest. She could run back to the cabin for help, but something inside her, something that had been growing all week in that clear mountain air, told her to stay put. She stood up tall, leveled that rifle, her hands steady as a rock. This here is private land, she said loud and clear. Y'all are trespassing. The men just stared at her, and one of them laughed. Well now, look at this little farm girl playing soldier. I am not playing. Now you can turn around, or you can find out if I am bluffing. She pulled back the hammer on the rifle. The click was the loudest sound in the whole valley. The laughter stopped right then. The 2 men gave each other a look. "This ain't worth the trouble," the one with the shotgun grumbled, and they pulled their horses around and rode off without another word. Mary stood there until the sound of the hoofbeats was completely gone. Then her hands started to shake and she had to sit down. When she got back to the cabin, Elias was splitting wood. He took one look at her face and set the axe down. "What happened?" "Two riders," he said. "They were looking at your cattle." His face did not change, but his eyes got tight. "Did they touch anything?" "No. I ran them off." He just stared at her for a long moment. "You ran them off. I had the rifle. Did they give you any trouble?" "They tried to. It did not work." Elias was quiet for a bit. Then he did something that just about broke her. He smiled. It was not a big grin, just a slow, warm smile that said more than words ever could. "I did not reckon I would have to worry about rustlers with you on the watch," he said. Mary felt her face get hot and turned away. "I was not brave," she mumbled. "I was scared to death," he answered. "That is what brave is, ma'am." She held the rifle tighter. "Mary," she said. "My name it is Mary, not ma'am." He picked up his axe and split a log clean in two. "All right, Mary," and just like that she was a person again. Not property, not a burden, but Mary. For the first time in her life, someone said her name like it actually meant something. In that moment, something stubborn and small deep inside her chest started to beat again. After that day, things were different. A quiet understanding grew between them. Mary started getting up before Elias, making the coffee, feeding the chickens. The first time it happened, he just stood in the doorway, surprised. "You did not have to do that." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." They fell into a rhythm that felt more like a conversation than work. He would start a job, and she would know just how to finish it. It was the most natural thing in the world. One evening, she was mending one of his torn shirts by the fire. He came in and said, "You do not have to mend my clothes." She looked up from her needle. "And you do not have to keep telling me what I do not have to do." He looked at her then, really looked, and a small smile touched his lips. "Fair enough," he said quietly. He sat down across from her, just watching her hands work. "My mother used to sew," Mary said, surprising herself. "She made all my dresses. After she passed, my father said sewing was a waste of time." Elias listened, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he asked, "What was her name?" No one had ever asked about her mother, not once in 14 years. "Ruth," she whispered, and her voice cracked. "That is a good name." "I reckon she was a good woman," he said gently. "She raised you." Mary's hands stopped moving. She would not cry. She had built a wall around that part of herself, and she refused to let this quiet, kind man tear it down. "You do not know what she raised," she said, her voice hard. "I know what is sitting right here in front of me," he answered. "A woman who stood up to two armed men and did not back down. I backed down plenty. You held your ground. That is what matters." The fire popped in the silence between them. "Why are you so kind to me?" she finally asked, the question that had been weighing on her heart since the day she arrived. "Is it because you feel sorry for me?" Elias leaned forward, his gaze steady and honest. "Mary, I have been alone on this mountain for 4 years. I have talked to my horses more than I have talked to people. I do not say things I do not mean, mostly because I forgot how to bother. I am kind to you because you are a person worth being kind to. It is as simple as that dot model. Have you ever seen someone so beaten down they forgot what kindness even felt like? That was Mary. A woman her own father sold off for 3 horses. But this story ain't about the cruelty she knew, it is about the quiet strength she found. Stick around, and I will tell you how a forgotten woman on a lonely mountain found her voice and served up the kind of justice that is best served cold. It started one evening when Elias told her, "She was a good woman." "I reckon she was. She raised you." Mary's hands froze, the mending needle shaking. She bit her cheek to keep from crying, refusing to let this quiet man with his scarred hands and gentle voice tear down the walls she had built. You do not know what she raised, Mary said, her voice like flint. Elias just looked at her. I know what is sitting right here in front of me, he said. A woman who stood up to two armed men without even blinking. Mary stabbed the needle through the cloth. Why are you so kind to me? The question she had been holding finally tumbled out. Elias leaned forward, his eyes steady on hers. Mary, I have been alone on this mountain for 4 years. I have talked to horses more than people. I forgot how to say things I do not mean. So when I tell you I am not being kind out of pity, you can believe it is the truth. Then why? She whispered. Because you deserve it. And because I think you have gone so long without it. You forgot what it looks like. She folded the mended shirt and set it aside. I am going to bed, she said softly. At the door, she stopped. Elias, the shirt is done. He nodded. She slipped inside her room, pressed her back to the door, and for the first time in 14 years, Mary cried. Not from pain, but from the terrifying, unbearable feeling of being treated like she mattered. The next morning, as she was weeding the garden, the sound of wagon wheels rolled up the trail. Elias came out of the barn, his jaw tight. Stay here, he said. Mary just shook her head. No, whatever is coming, I am standing right here. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. He went inside and came back with 2 rifles, handing one to her without a word. When the wagon came into view, Mary's stomach dropped. She knew that wagon, those horses, and the man holding the reins. It was her father. Hank Whitaker pulled up 30 yards from the cabin. He climbed down slow, looking thinner and somehow meaner than she remembered. His eyes were bloodshot. On the wagon sat a young man wearing a marshal's badge. Well, Hank said with a false smile. There she is. Elias stepped forward, a calm wall between Hank and Mary. Mr. Whitaker, that is a long ride up here. It is, Hank spat. Seems my daughter has caused some talk in town, folks saying I sold her to a mountain hermit. The young deputy marshal climbed down, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Boone, ma'am, I am Deputy Wells. I just need to confirm the lady is here of her own choosing. She is, Elias said flatly. I would prefer to hear it from her. Elias stepped aside. Mary felt her father's cold stare, the old threat in his eyes that had ruled her for 26 years. But this time was different. Gripping the rifle, she looked the deputy square in the eye. I am here because I want to be. Ma'am, is that the truth? Nobody is forcing you. The only man who ever forced me to do anything, she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong, is standing right behind you. The air turned electric. You ungrateful girl, Hank snarled. I am not finished, Mary declared, surprising everyone, most of all herself. My father traded me like I was livestock. He never asked my opinion about anything. Mr. Boone, Mary continued, looking at the stunned deputy, asked me on the very first day if I wanted to be here. He told me I could leave any time. He has not laid a hand on me or raised his voice. He has shown me more respect in 2 weeks than my father has in my entire life. A dead silence fell. Hank took a step, his face turning red. Now you listen here. I am not a girl, Mary said, lifting her chin. And I am not yours, not anymore. You hear this? Hank pleaded with the deputy. He has poisoned her mind. He barely talks to me, Mary said with a sad laugh. That is the point. He does not have to say a word, and I still feel safer here than I ever did under your roof. Hank's hand clenched into a fist. He took another step, but Elias moved between them, smooth and final. That is close enough. The deputy cleared his throat, his voice now firm. Mr. Whitaker, the lady says she is here willingly. I reckon we are done here. Hank stood there, trembling with rage. He stared at Mary like he had never seen her before. And maybe he had not. The woman with steel in her voice was not someone he had ever allowed to exist. You will regret this, he seethed. Maybe, Mary answered. but I will regret it free." Hank climbed back onto the wagon and left without another word. As the wagon disappeared, Mary's knees gave out. Elias caught her arm, his grip steady. "I cannot believe I just did that," she whispered. "I can," he said simply. "He is going to come back. He will make trouble." Elias looked down at her, his hand still on her arm. "Let him." "You did not step in," she said, looking up at him. "You let me speak for myself." "It was not my speech to give," he answered. "Most men would have spoken for me." "I am not most men." "No," she agreed softly. "You are not." That night they sat on the porch looking at the stars. The sky up here felt wider, closer. "I never thanked you," Mary said into the quiet. "For what?" "For not selling me back to him." Elias looked at the stars. "I did not buy you in the first place, Mary. A person staying where they choose to stay. That is not a favor. That is just how things ought to be." And in the peaceful quiet of that mountain, Mary finally understood. She was home. Mary balled herself up small on the porch steps. "Can I ask you something, Elias?" He just nodded. "Why are you up here all alone?" He took his time answering. "I had a wife, Elizabeth. Calera took her and our little boy 6 years back. He was only 3. Mary's breath caught in her throat. "I buried them both, then rode up here and started building. Haven't been back down since." She felt a sting in her eyes. "I am so sorry." "Do not be," he said, his voice low. "I told you because you understand what it is to lose it all and not break." She pressed her face to her knees. "I never had anything to lose." His voice was gentle but solid as a rock. "That ain't true, Mary. You always had yourself. Getting up each morning when you got no reason to, that ain't nothing. That is everything." She looked up, tears shining on her face. "If you keep on, I might just start to believe you." A slow, warm smile touched his lips. "I reckon you find out what happens then." Mary wiped her eyes and stood. "Good night, Elias." She went inside, but something had changed between them in the quiet of the mountain. It felt like they had found a place where the world could not reach them. But the world was already on its way. 3 days later, Mary was hanging clothes when she saw 4 riders on the ridge. Lawmen, not outlaws. She saw the glint of a badge on Sheriff Caldwell, and her blood ran cold when she saw the 4th man. Her father, Hank. She dropped everything and ran, hollering for Elias. He came out of the barn, took one look at her face, and then at the ridge. He did not flinch. He just looked right at her and said, "We stand together." Mary grabbed her rifle and stood right beside him as the men rode up. Her father hung back by the trees, just watching, a smirk on his face. "Sheriff," Elias said, calm as could be, his rifle pointed at the ground, "looks like you brought trouble with you." Caldwell's jaw clenched. "Do not you get smart, Boone. Hank Whitaker filed a complaint. Says you are holding his daughter against her will." "That is a lie," Mary cut in, stepping forward. Caldwell ignored her. "Ma'am, I will get to you." "No, you will listen to me now," she snapped. "I told your deputy I am here by my own choice. My father is a liar," Mary stated plainly. "From the trees," Hank yelled. "See? He has put words in her mouth." "These are my own words," Mary shot back, her knuckles white on the rifle. "You just never listened." The sheriff turned to Elias. "Did any money change hands for her?" "Hank offered a trade for work," Elias said plainly. "Supplies and horses. I told Mary she had a choice, and she chose to come." Caldwell sneered. "There are laws about appearances, Boone. A young woman living with a man she ain't married to." "You rode 4 hours up here for appearances?" Mary said, her voice dripping with scorn. "I rode up here because a judge sent me," Caldwell growled. "So we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. Your choice." "And what is hard?" Elias asked, his voice steady. "Hard is me taking you to town in irons." "On what charge?" Elias asked. "Abduction, maybe. Depends on the judge. A father's word carries a lot of weight around here. More than hers. The younger Deputy Wells looked uneasy and glanced away from Mary. Caldwell got off his horse and walked toward the porch. "Look, Boone, I have to answer the complaint. So you are riding back to town with me. We will all stand before Judge Harmon and let him sort it out. You can come willing, or you can come in chains. It will look a whole lot worse for you if it is chains." Elias looked at Mary, and in his eyes she saw the question again. "Your choice." "I will go," he said. "No!" Mary grabbed his arm. "They can't. If I fight, it just proves their story," he told her quietly. "If I go willing, I prove mine. I do not want to be free without." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Something changed in Elias's eyes then. He gently took the rifle from her. "Hold the homestead," he said. "I will be back." He gave his rifle to the sheriff and mounted his horse. Mary could only watch as they rode off. Her father was the last to pass, and he gave her a satisfied smile. That smile was crueler than any blow. It was the smile of the man who thought he had finally won, who believed he still had control over her. He thought she would just stand there and wait. He was wrong. The moment the dust settled, Mary went inside. She was done with being afraid. She was done with being underestimated. She packed her mother's Bible into a saddlebag, saddled her horse, and took off for town. She rode hard, taking the mountain shortcuts Elias had taught her. She reached the town of Ridgeway just as the sun went down, covered in grit and ready to fight. Mary hitched her horse in front of the general store and looked toward the courthouse. Caldwell's men were already there. They'd taken the main road and beat her, but not by much. As she walked down the dusty street, folks stopped and stared. It was Mary Whitaker, the girl her own father traded away like a sack of feed. Now she was walking alone, jaws set firm, looking like she was heading into a fight. Mrs. Garrett came out of her shop and froze. "Mary, child, what on earth?" "The hearing is at the courthouse," Mary said, her voice steady. "But your father told us—" "I don't much care what my father said," Mary replied, and kept on walking. The courthouse was already half full of ranchers and townsfolk. Elias sat in a chair, looking worn down but not broken. When the doors creaked open and he saw Mary, a look of profound relief washed over his face. He had been ready to face this storm all by himself, but now he knew he did not have to. Across the room, Hank Whitaker's smug expression soured the moment he saw his daughter. "What is she doing here?" he barked. Judge Harmon, a man known for his fairness, looked up over his glasses. "I expect she is here because this business concerns her," the judge said plainly. "Take a seat, miss." "I believe I will stand, Your Honor." A quiet gasp went through the room. Women did not speak up in court, and they certainly did not defy a judge. Judge Harmon just nodded. "Suit yourself." Now, Mr. Whitaker claims Mr. Elias Boone took his daughter through a dishonest trade. Mr. Boone says otherwise. I have heard from the sheriff and the father. Now, I want to hear from the man himself. Elias stood up and told the simple truth. He explained the trade, how he had asked Mary if she wanted to come with him, and how he gave her a room of her own and the freedom to leave whenever she chose. "Have you ever forced yourself on this woman?" the judge asked directly. "No, sir," Elias said. "Have you made her stay?" "I have told her every day she is free to go," Elias answered. Hank jumped from his chair. "He has twisted her mind. She is a simple girl." "I am not simple," Mary's voice rang out clear as a church bell. "And I am not a girl. I am 26 years old. I can read, write, and run a trap line. I can surely speak for myself." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harmon leaned back. "Then speak, Miss Whitaker." With every eye in town on her, Mary took a deep breath. "My father traded me for 3 horses and some supplies. He described me to Mr. Boone as strong and quiet, the same way you would describe a mule." "Now see here," Hank sputtered. "Let the woman finish," the judge ordered. "After my mother passed, I became his worker. I cooked, cleaned, and mended. In return, he told me every day that I was a useless burden. Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. "Mr. Boone is the first man in 14 years who asked for my opinion. He gave me good work, a safe place, and a rifle to stand beside him, not behind him. He has treated me with more respect in 3 weeks than my own father has in my entire life." She turned to face Hank. "You are not here because you are worried about me. You are here because I am no longer afraid of you, and that scares you more than anything." "She is lying!" Hank roared, his face turning red. "Any father would—" "Any father," Mary cut in, her voice low and sharp, "would have said her name." Silence fell again, heavier this time. "In all my years in your house, you called me girl or her. You never once, not one single time, said the name Mary." Hank's mouth opened and closed. He could not deny it because everyone in that room knew it was the gospel truth. Judge Harmon took off his spectacles and polished them slowly. "Mr. Whitaker, did you or did you not offer your daughter as part of a trade?" Hank stammered. "It was a customary arrangement. For her own good. It seems to me she needed someone to ask what she needed," the judge said. "And Mr. Boone was the only one who bothered to do that. I am dismissing this complaint. The woman is of age and is here by her own free will. Mr. Whitaker, if you bother your daughter again, I will issue an order against you." He banged his gavel. "We are done here." The room filled with noise as people stood up, talking all at once. Mrs. Garrett was in the back, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Mary walked straight to Elias, who looked at her with a quiet admiration that made her feel 10 feet tall. Elias got up and walked right over to Mary. She was trying her best to stand tall, but a tremor ran through her, clear down to her boots. Her hands shook and her jaw was set hard. She looked up at him, her eyes a mix of fire and fear. He just said, "You came." "Did you think I wouldn't?" she asked, her voice tight. "I wasn't sure. I'm still learning you." Deputy Wells stepped up beside them. "Mr. Boone, Miss Whitaker, y'all might ought to head out before her daddy gets his wind back and causes a ruckus." "Too late for that," Elias murmured. He put a hand on the small of her back and guided her to the door. Out on the street, the setting sun painted everything gold. Folks watched from their porches, their whispers following them. Mary didn't give a damn. She had walked into that courthouse a nobody, and walked out a woman who owned her own story. Elias untied his horse while she untied the mayor's. "You rode the mountain trail alone," he said, noting the horse's condition. "You showed me the path once," she replied. "That was all it took." He shook his head, a ghost of a smile on his face. That smile did funny things to her heart. "Mary Whitaker," he said, "you are really something." "I'm just plain tired, is what I am." They made camp at a flat spot Elias knew by an aspen grove. He built the fire while she took care of the horses, both of them moving in a familiar rhythm. But tonight, the air between them felt charged, like right before a storm. Mary sat with her mother's Bible on her lap. "She would have been proud of you today," Elias said softly. Mary looked up at him. "How would you know?" "Because I am." She clutched the book to her chest. "Elias," she began, "when we get back to the homestead, I don't want my own room anymore." The fire popped in the quiet. From the darkness, an owl called out. Elias looked at her across the flames, and this time he gave her a full, genuine smile. "All right," he said. The single word was quiet, but it felt as solid as a promise. Mary laid down on her bedroll, the warmth of the fire on her face. She felt the weight of 26 years of silence finally lift from her soul. She had found her voice. She had been heard. And the man who never asked her to be anyone but herself was sitting just a few feet away, keeping watch. "Home," she whispered into the night. The word finally sounded like freedom. Their ride back was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence now. the kind shared between two people who had walked through fire together. Every muscle in Mary's body ached, but deep down, beneath all the exhaustion, something new had taken root. It felt like iron that had been forged and cooled, hard, strong, and permanent. She was never going back to the woman she used to be. When they reached the last ridge and saw the cabin below, Mary pulled her horse to a stop. "What is it?" Elias asked. "Nothing," she said, just taking in the sight of the cabin, the corral, the porch. "Nothing's wrong." He followed her gaze and understood. "Welcome home, Mary." That night they fell into their easy routine. But after the plates were cleared, Mary sat by the fireplace instead of going to her room. Elias took his usual chair across from her. "I meant what I said," she told him, her voice steady. "About the room." Elias sighed. "Mary, you don't have to—" "If you say I don't have to one more time," she cut in, "I'm going to throw this coffee cup straight at your head." He looked at her, and then a strange thing happened. They both started to laugh. Not a small chuckle, but a real deep laugh that seemed to chase the shadows out of the corners of the cabin. When they finally quieted down, the whole place felt lighter. "I ain't any good at this," Elias said, his voice a little rough. "I've been on my own so long, I'm not sure I know how to be with someone." "You think I'm any better?" Mary countered. "Before you, my longest talks were with the chickens." He smiled that real smile of his. "Well, they are good listeners." He grew serious then. "Mary, I need to tell you something. When your father stood on my porch, talking about you like you were a piece of furniture he was getting rid of, I wanted to hit him. I wanted to break his jaw right then and there." Mary just stared at him, speechless. "I didn't take his deal because I needed a hand. I could have hired help. I took it because I looked at you, standing there by that fence, and I saw a person who was fading away in that house. The real you was dying, and it seemed like nobody else was even going to notice." He leaned forward, his hands clenched. "I told myself it was just a good deed. But the whole truth is, when I saw you, something in my chest that's been dead for 6 long years started to stir." Mary looked down at her own hands, at the new calluses and scars from real work. These weren't the hands of the woman she used to be. These hands had held a rifle and worked the land. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Nobody ever showed me." "Me neither," he said. "Elizabeth and I, we just figured it out together." It was the first time he had said his late wife's name. "Tell me about her," Mary said softly. Most women would have been scared to ask, but Mary wasn't most women. "She was small," Elias began, his voice thick with memory, "but she had the spirit of a giant, strongest woman I ever knew, till I met you." A faint blush rose on Mary's cheeks. "She loved wildflowers, made me promise I wouldn't stop living after she was gone. I swore I would, and then I broke that promise for 6 years. "You didn't break it," Mary said, her gaze unwavering. "You just paused." He looked at her then, and something in his eyes shifted, like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long storm. "Paused," he repeated, as if tasting the word. And in that one word, a new beginning finally felt possible for them both. "Mary," Elias said, her name sounding like a prayer. "I'm going to put my things in your room now," she told him. "And if you say I do not have to, I might just get mad." He smiled. I was not about to say a word. They stood there, the firelight dancing between them. Mary stepped forward and laid her hand flat against his chest. She felt his heart, beating strong and steady. "There it is," she whispered. His hand, warm and gentle, covered hers. "Mary," he said softly, "I'm going to kiss you now, and I am not going to apologize for it." "I would be mighty upset if you did," she replied. He kissed her slowly, with a tenderness that spoke of choices made and rights that were earned. When he pulled back, Mary kept her eyes closed, memorizing the feeling of being treasured. "Well," she finally said, a smile spreading across her face. That was worth waiting 26 years for. Every single one, he said, and pulled her close, and she felt his heart beating strong and true. For the first time, Mary Whitaker felt right where she belonged. But the next morning, everything went sideways. Shouting woke Mary up. It wasn't Elias, who was already outside. The yell was high and scared, coming from past the corral. She pulled on a dress and ran out, rifle in hand. Elias was knelt over a boy in the meadow. He couldn't have been more than 14, his face swollen and his lips split clean open. He was shaking something fierce. "Easy now, son," Elias said softly. "Nobody's gonna hurt you." The boy gasped. "They're coming. Dalton's men. They took everything. They hit our ranch, beat my pa, and run off with the herd. Mama sent me to get help." Mary knelt and felt the boy's forehead. He was burning up with fever. "What's your name?" she asked. "Samuel," he whispered. "Our place is down on the South Fork, about a 3-hour ride." Mary looked at Elias. He was already doing the math. "Dalton's outfit," he said, "on Florida maybe 5 men. They've been plaguing these valleys all summer. You know 'em? Heard of 'em. They hit the Henderson place back in June and took 40 head. And nobody did a thing about it. The sheriff don't ride this high up." Mary's jaw tightened as she looked at the boy's bruised face. "How many folks at your place?" she asked. "My ma, my pa, and my little sister. Pa is hurt something bad." Mary stood straight and tall. "We're going, Elias." "Mary." Her voice was like cold steel. "Don't you tell me it's dangerous. That family needs us, and we're the only ones close enough to matter." Elias looked at her for a long moment, then gave one sharp nod. "Saddle the horses. I'll get the guns." They moved with purpose. While Elias packed ammunition and supplies, Mary gave the boy some water and jerky. In less than 20 minutes, the 3 of them were riding south. Samuel, fueled by fear for his family, pushed his horse hard down a trail through the thick timber. Mary and Elias rode alongside each other, a silent understanding passing between them. The choice was made. About 2 hours later, Samuel pulled his horse to a stop. "Smoke," he said, his voice trembling. Mary could smell it too, thick wood smoke drifting up from the valley. "That ain't no campfire," Elias said, his voice gone hard and cold. It was the voice of a man who'd seen too much. "Did they burn something?" Mary asked. "Could be the barn. Maybe the whole house. Smoke's too thick to say." A little wounded sound escaped Samuel's throat, and it cut Mary to the quick. "We'll get there," she promised him. "We'll get there." When they finally cleared the trees, they saw the Puit homestead. The barn was engulfed in flames. The front door of the house was torn clean off its hinges. Elias turned to Samuel. "You wait here. If you ride in there, you become another person I gotta protect. Watch our backs. If you see anyone coming, fire 1 shot in the air." Samuel nodded, his chin quivering. Elias looked at Mary, a question in his eyes. "Don't you even think it," she said. "I was gonna say just stay on my left. I shoot right-handed." They rode down into the scene of pure destruction. Fences were torn down and feed was scattered everywhere. "Hello," Elias called out. "Mr. Pruitt? Mrs. Pruitt?" A shotgun poked out from a window in the house. "Who's asking?" a woman called back, her voice tight with fear. "Name's Elias Boone. Your boy found us. We're here to help." After a long silence, the shotgun disappeared. A thin woman with graying hair and blood on her apron appeared in the busted doorway. "They took 'em all," she said, her eyes wide and wild. "Every last one. They beat my Tom till he couldn't get up." Mary swung down from her horse. "I need clean rags and water now." The woman stared. "Who are you?" "My name's Mary. I'm going to help your husband." Mrs. Pruitt's face just seemed to crumble with relief. "He's in the back room. Please help him." Mary went inside to find Tom Pruitt on a straw mattress, his face swollen and his breathing shallow. His leg was bent at an ugly angle. Mary had set bones before on her father's ranch. Hired hands got hurt, and you learned by doing. "Mr. Pewitt," she said calmly, "this is going to hurt something awful, but you have to hold still." She worked quick, using cloth for splints and a wooden spoon to set the break. Tom Pewitt let out one terrible scream, then clamped his jaw shut. "You've done this before," Mrs. Pewitt whispered from the doorway. "Too many times," Mary answered. When she came back outside, Elias was studying the dirt near the corral. "5 riders," he announced, "driving about 30 head south. They got maybe 5 hours on us." "Can you track 'em?" Mary asked. "Can I? Yes. Should I? That's 5 armed men." He looked her straight in the eye. "You stood down 2 men with a rifle and never even blinked. You rode all night to save me. You just set a man's leg with a spoon." He stood up straighter. "I reckon that makes it 2 of us against 5 of them." "You do what you think is right, Mary. This is your call." The words made something warm bloom in her chest. It was the feeling of a man looking right at you, seeing everything, and deciding you were more than enough. "Mrs. Pewitt," Mary called out, "we are heading out to get your cattle." The woman appeared at her doorway, looking worn. "You 2 against 5 men?" "Your boy is up the trail," Mary assured her. "He will come down and stay with you. Just keep that shotgun handy. We plan to be back by sundown." "And if you are not?" Mary shared a look with Elias. He just nodded. "We will be," Mary said with certainty. They rode along the creek, following a trail even she could read now. Elias had taught her how to spot the deep print of a loaded horse and how to judge its speed. Elias rode with his rifle resting on his saddle, his face set in a quiet focus Mary had never seen. It was the look of a man getting ready for a fight. "Have you had to kill men before?" she asked softly. "Yes." "Does it ever get easier?" "No," he said. "And you ought to worry about any man who says it does. I truly do not want to hurt anyone." "Neither do I," Elias admitted. "But those folks deserve to have their cattle back. And I aim to keep you safe. If pulling a trigger is what it takes, then I will." "So will I," she said. He glanced over at her. "I know you will. That is what has me so worried." "You are scared of losing me?" "Yeah, scares me to death." The words just hung there in the air between them. They found Dalton's crew a 2-hour ride south, camped in a canyon with the stolen herd. 5 men in all, acting sloppy and careless. "What is the plan?" she whispered. "I will go in from the east," he said. "You stay up here on the ridge. When you hear my first shot, you fire a round into the dirt right next to the sleeping one. A scared man will run, not fight." Something fierce and tender flickered in his eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he finally said. Mary settled onto the ridge, resting the rifle on a flat rock and finding the sleeping man in her sights. Below, Elias moved like a ghost among the rocks, and then disappeared. A minute later, a gunshot echoed through the canyon. Mary fired. The sleeping man jumped up, hollering as dirt flew up a foot from his head. The men at the fire scattered. Elias's voice boomed off the canyon walls. "You are surrounded. Drop your guns and walk away from here. The cattle are not yours." One of them shot blindly toward the sound of Elias's voice. Mary saw the flash and sent a round into the rock 3 inches from his head. Rock chips peppered his face. He dropped his gun and threw his hands up high. "The next one will not miss," Mary yelled, her voice ringing out clear and strong across the canyon. The other men looked at each other, then toward the glint of Mary's rifle. In their whiskey-soaked panic, 2 shooters from different angles felt like a whole army. One by one, their guns hit the dirt. "Walk south," Elias ordered, stepping out from behind a boulder. "And keep on walking." They stumbled away, 5 men bested by 2, because those 2 had something real to fight for. Mary stayed on that ridge until they were long gone, and only then did her hands begin to shake. When she finally climbed down, Elias was already gathering the cattle. He looked up at her, covered in dust, but alive. "You shot at a man's head," he said, his voice low. "I shot at a rock next to his head," she corrected. "There is a big difference. Not much of one." He walked right up to her and took the rifle from her trembling hands. Then he pulled her in and held her so tight she could feel his heart pounding. "Do not ever scare me like that again," he murmured into her hair. "You do not ever ask me to ride away from you again." "Deal," he said. They had the cattle back in the Puit corral before the sun had fully set. Mrs. Puit just watched them file in, then sat right down on her porch steps and cried. Her boy, Samuel, ran out, his bruised face breaking into a huge grin. "They are all here," he yelled. Mrs. Puit stood up straight and looked at Mary and Elias with a gratitude that was deeper than words. "Neighbors," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That is who they are. Neighbors." That word settled over Mary like a warm blanket. She had never belonged anywhere before. They stayed just long enough to see that the family was all right. "You come back now, you hear?" Mrs. Puit said, gripping Mary's hand. "Come back because I would surely like to have a friend." Mary squeezed her hand back, unable to speak, and just nodded. They rode home under a sky full of stars. "Elias," she said quietly. "Yeah? We did a good thing today." "Yes, we did. I do not think I have ever done a good thing before. Not one that mattered." "That is not true," he said. "You matter to me. That is a good thing that happens every single day." She reached across and took his hand, and he laced his fingers right through hers. They rode the rest of the way home like that, quiet and complete. Back at the cabin, Elias tended to the horses while Mary started a fire and put the coffee on. She looked around the small room that had become their home. He came in smelling of horse and gunpowder and the night air. "Coffee is on," she said. He sat down and she poured them each a cup. "Elias, yeah, I love you," she said, plain as day. She had proven it to herself and was done questioning it. Elias set his cup down and turned to her, cupping her face in his scarred, gentle hands. "I love you, Mary. I have been loving you since the day you stood by that fence, and I could not bring myself to look away." She placed her hands over his. "Then stop looking away," she whispered. He did not. 3 weeks became 3 months. Every morning Mary woke up next to him and had to remember that this new life was real, that the arm around her waist belonged to a good man, that the quiet sounds were just the wind in the trees and the creek outside. Some days the feeling made her smile. Other days it was a gratitude so deep it felt like an ache in her chest. This morning, though, she woke up to find him already on the porch, staring out at the trail. "What is it?" she asked. "There is a rider coming," he said. Mary's hand went straight for the rifle by the door. It was just instinct now. 3 months had passed. Elias was on the porch when he saw a lone rider. "Easy," he said. "Just one rider, coming slow from the Puit Trail." It was Samuel. The boy had filled out, taller and stronger. The bruises were gone, replaced by a healthy tan and a wide grin. "Morning, Miss Mary. Mr. Boone." "Samuel," Mary said, smiling. "Does your mama know you're out here by yourself?" "Yes'm, she sent me. I got a letter for you." He handed her a folded piece of paper. Mary read it, and then read it again, her hand starting to tremble. "What is it?" Elias asked, setting his coffee cup down. Mary looked up, her eyes bright and strange. "My father is dead." The words fell onto the porch with a heavy thud. "When?" "3 days ago." His heart just gave out. Mrs. Garrett wrote that the hired hands found him in the house the next morning, all alone. Samuel fidgeted on his horse, not knowing what to say. He was old enough to know this was heavy news. What are you supposed to feel when the man who made your life a living hell finally dies? That's a question nobody prepares you for. When the letter came, Mary Whitaker felt nothing. Not sadness, not anger, just a whole lot of empty space. Her husband, Elias, knew better than to push. He understood that Mary handled her troubles in the quiet first. Finally, she spoke. "It's not right. I feel nothing for my own father." Elias's voice was low and steady. "After a man like Hank Whitaker, You don't owe him a single tear. You feel what's true in your heart. Mary looked at her hands, thinking on that. Free, she whispered, like it was a dirty word. I feel free, and I hate myself for it. Elias gently took her hands. You spent 26 years under a man who treated you like a piece of property. Feeling free is the most honest thing in the world. You don't owe him your grief. But he died all alone, she said, her voice cracking. Elias shook his head. He chose that path every single time he hurt you. Every time he made you feel small, he was choosing to be alone. This wasn't your doing, Mary, it was his. That answer didn't stop the pain, though. She finally broke down, not for the cruel man who was gone, but for the father she'd always wanted and never had. Elias just held her, solid and sure, letting the storm pass. When the tears stopped, she straightened her shoulders. I need to go to the ranch, she said. Not for him. I need to visit my mother's grave. There's something else, she added. The ranch. It's mine now. She saw a flicker of worry in Elias's eyes, the fear that this land might pull her back into her old life. She placed a hand on his chest. I'm going to settle what needs settling, and then I'm coming right back home to you. He squeezed her hand. I'll ride with you. 2 days later, they rode into the valley. The place felt heavy, suffocating after so many months of open sky. The ranch looked as broken as the man who'd owned it. Fences were down and the barn leaned like it was tired of standing. Mary's old garden was just a patch of weeds and packed dirt. She stood before the house for a long moment before pushing the door open. The smell of stale whiskey and dust rolled out to meet her. It was a sad, small house for a sad, small man. She walked through the filthy rooms, a ghost in her own past, seeing not a home, but a prison. In her old room, a space barely bigger than a closet, she checked a familiar spot. Behind a loose board where she used to hide treasures, she found a faded photograph. It was her mother, young and smiling, holding a baby, holding her. Mary clutched the picture to her chest. There you are, Mama, she whispered. She walked out of that house and never looked back. Elias was waiting. He saw the photo, saw the peace settle on her face, and simply nodded. She was finally truly free. Mary rode out to the old cemetery where the town ended. Her mother's grave, Ruth Whitaker's, was nearly swallowed by weeds, the name on the wooden cross weathered down to almost nothing. Mary knelt and cleared the plot with her bare hands, feeling the damp earth. When she was done, she laid her palm flat on the soil. I am doing all right, Mama. I found a good man. You would like him. He has a quiet way about him, just like you. And he really sees me. She placed a single wildflower on the grave. It felt like settling a long overdue debt. I am fixing to get you a proper headstone, she whispered. One with your name on it, a real name. Not just a wife or a mother, just Ruth. When she stood, Elias was standing about 10 feet away, holding his hat, his head bowed. He looked like he had been praying. The lawyer's office was a cramped room over the general store. Mr. Prescott was a small man with ink on his fingers and spectacles that made his eyes look big. He offered his condolences for her father. Thank you, she said. I believe there are papers. Prescott shuffled a stack on his desk. Yes, your father left no will, which means the ranch now belongs to you. 40 acres, the house, and whatever livestock is left. He peered at her. I have to tell you, it is in a sorry state. I know. What are you planning to do with it? Mary glanced at Elias. He stood by the door, his face calm, leaving the decision entirely up to her. Sell it, Mary said. Prescott blinked. All of it? Every last acre, the house, the barn, all of it. Miss Whitaker, are you sure? Land in this valley is valuable. I am certain, Mr. Prescott. I do not want it. I will not let that piece of land have a hold on me any longer. Very well, he said, adjusting his glasses. I can arrange the sale. Where should I send the money? Mary finally let a real smile show. Send every last dime to the Puitt family, over at South Fork Ranch. Elias turned his head sharply. She could feel his surprised gaze on her, warm as the sun, but she kept her eyes on the lawyer. "All of it?" Prescott asked, stunned. "Every penny," Mary confirmed. "Their barn needs rebuilding and their father needs a doctor. That money will do more good for them than it ever did for me." Prescott wrote it all down, slow and careful, like he knew he was part of something important. "I will just need you to sign here, Mrs. Boone." The name came out of her mouth before she even thought it. She felt Elias go completely still behind her. "I beg your pardon," Mr. Prescott said. Mary turned to face Elias. He stood there with his hat in his hands, his face stripped of all the walls he had built up over the years. Open and unguarded. "If you will have me," she said, her voice soft but steady. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and took her face in his hands, gentle as can be. "Mary," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have been yours since the day you stood up to those cattle thieves." "Is that a yes?" she asked. "That is a yes, a hallelujah, and an amen." Mr. Prescott cleared his throat. "Well, I can draw up a marriage license right now if you would like. I am a notary, which is about as good as a preacher in this territory." "Do it," Mary said, looking straight at Elias, "right now." And so they were married right there in that dusty office above the general store. There were no flowers, no music, and no family. Elias said, "I do," like a man who had waited a lifetime to say it. And Mary said, "I do," like a woman who finally knew she was home. Prescott gave the certificate a hard, final stamp and offered them both a firm handshake. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Boone." They stepped out onto the street into the bright midday sun. And you better believe every eye in town was on them. There was Mary Whitaker, now Mary Boone, walking down Main Street arm in arm with the mountain man folks had whispered about for years. Mrs. Garrett was standing on the boardwalk of her mercantile. Her gaze shifted from Mary to Elias, then settled on the way Mary's hand rested so easily in his arm. It just looked right. "Mary Whitaker," Mrs. Garrett said. "What in the world have you done?" "I got married." "To who?" "To the only man who ever cared what I thought." Tears filled Mrs. Garrett's eyes. She put a hand to her mouth, then pulled Mary into a hug so tight it stole her breath. "Your mama would be dancing in the streets," she whispered. That afternoon they rode out of that town for good, heading up into the hills and toward home. The words settled deep inside Mary, solid and sure. When they arrived, Samuel was on the porch carving a piece of wood. He jumped right to his feet. "Is everything all right? You did not have any trouble, did you?" "No trouble at all," Elias said. "We went and got married." The boy's jaw dropped clean open. Then he let out a happy holler that sent the chickens scattering. "Just wait until I tell Mama. She is going to cry for a solid week." "You can tell your Mama something else too," Mary said. She swung down from her horse and looked at the young man who had trusted them completely. "Tell her the money from my father's ranch is coming to her, all of it." Samuel just stared, stunned. "Miss Mary, Mrs. Boone, we could not possibly take that." "Yes, you can, and you will," she insisted gently. "Your pa needs a real doctor, your barn needs a new roof, and your mama deserves a full night of sleep. That money cannot bring my father back, but it can help your family get back on their feet. That is its purpose now." The boy's eyes got shiny with tears. He wiped them fast on his sleeve, trying to be a man about it. "Thank you," he managed, his voice cracking. "Now go on home, Samuel. Tell your folks." He got on his horse, turned once in the saddle to wave, and Mary waved right back. Then they were alone, just like in the beginning. But nothing was the same. That evening, Mary sat at their table. Her mother's photograph was propped against the salt jar, with the marriage certificate spread out beside it. She held the 2 papers, marveling at how a life could turn on a dime, how a woman could see the sun rise as another man's property and watch it set as a wife, a true partner. Her own name was on a legal document, declaring she belonged to herself. Elias came in and sat down across from her. He said, "I aim to build another room." "For what?" "For what is to come." Mary looked right at him. He held her gaze, steady and patient as a sunrise. "Are you thinking about a family, Elias Boone?" I am thinking about possibilities. She had not thought about that in 6 long years. Are you not scared? I am terrified. Good, she said. Me too. We can be terrified together. She reached out and took his hand, her thumb tracing an old scar. I want to plant flowers, she said, the kind Elizabeth liked. Elias's breath hitched, and his hand squeezed hers. You do not have to do that. His voice was thick with something more than mountain air. I want to, she said. She was a part of this land before I was. Her and your son. They ought to be remembered. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. Ruth and Elizabeth, he said. What is that? If we are ever blessed with a daughter, that will be her name. Ruth and Elizabeth, both of them. Mary felt a lump form in her throat. She whispered, Ruth Elizabeth Boone. Now that is a name with real meaning. That name is everything. The summer burned bright across the mountains. Mary planted her wildflowers, and Elias built the new room. The Pewitt family came for supper one Sunday, and Mrs. Pewitt cried just like Samuel said she would. Tom Pewitt shook Elias's hand for so long that Mary finally had to tell him to let the man's arm go. News traveled through the valley the way it always does, a trickle at first, then a flood. The story of Mary Whitaker, a woman traded for 3 horses, sent up a mountain who found love and fought for it. In town, young women started saying her name like she was a legend in the making. One afternoon, while weeding the garden, Mary heard a horse. She stood and shielded her eyes. A young girl, maybe 17, sat on a tired horse with just a canvas sack. She stopped at the edge of the property. Her shoulders were slumped and her eyes were red. Are you Mary Boone? The girl asked, her voice trembling. I am. My name is Clara Jennings. I came from town. Mrs. Garrett told me where I could find you. What can I do for you, Clara? The girl's chin quivered. My father is making me marry Mr. Thorne, the banker. He is 53 years old. I am only 17. My father says I should be thankful. Mary put down her garden hoe. Get down from that horse, she said. Come on inside. We have coffee. Clara followed her in, clutching that sack like a lifeline. Elias was at the table and he looked up. He saw the girl's face and the bruise she was trying to hide on her wrist. He stood up straight. I will be in the barn. Mary said, Stay. Their eyes met, a whole conversation passing between them. He sat back down, put his rifle aside, and poured a 3rd cup of coffee for the girl. Clara held the cup like it was the first bit of warmth she had felt in a long, long time. Tell me all of it, Mary said. Start from the very beginning. When Clara finished, Mary leaned in close. This is what we are going to do. You will stay here tonight. Tomorrow I will ride into town and have a talk with your father. If he does not listen, then I will talk to Judge Harmon. He will not listen to you. Then the judge will. How can you be so sure? Because I stood up in that same courtroom and I told the truth. And the truth won the day. It will win for you, too. Mrs. Garrett told me you were brave, Clara said, her eyes welling up. I did not change a thing. I just decided to stop being quiet. Elias looked at his wife across the table, her face now carved by mountain wind and a joy that is earned, not given. He saw Ruth Whitaker's daughter and Elizabeth Boone's legacy. He saw the woman who had faced down hopelessness and refused to be broken. You can stay as long as you need to, Elias told Clara. No one will take you from here. The girl looked from him to Mary, then buried her face in her hands and cried. Mary went to her and put an arm around her shaking shoulders. She held her just like she wished someone had held her all those years ago. You are safe now, Mary said. How did you do it? Clara whispered. How did you learn to be brave? Mary looked over at Elias. He met her gaze with that same look from the first day, steady and warm. I never stopped being afraid, Mary told her. I just found something worth being brave for. Later that night, Clara was asleep in the new room, the room built for second chances. Mary and Elias stood on the porch looking at the stars. He wrapped his arm around her. We are going to keep on doing this, are we not? He said, more a statement than a question. Doing what? She asked. taking in strays. We are not strays, Elias. We are just folks who got lost for a while. She smiled and leaned into him. I used to believe God had forgotten all about me. Now, I think he was just waiting for me to find my way to the right place. To you. This place is you. He kissed the top of her head. The wind sang through the trees and the creek murmured its old song. Mary Whitaker Boone stood on that porch, held by a man who had only ever asked her to be herself. Down in the valley, people who had once looked right through her were now speaking her name with respect. Behind her, a young girl was sleeping safe in a room built on hope. The stars burned in a sky so vast it made every small cruelty she had ever endured seem like nothing at all. She had been treated like livestock. She had been called worthless. She had been cast aside. And she had taken every last hurt and turned it into a life so full of love and stubborn purpose that the mountain itself seemed proud of her. No one would ever own her. She was strong, she was unbreakable, and Mary Boone, finally and truly free, was just getting started.